Sean sat with his legs stretched out in front of him, his eye wrapped tightly around his torso as he huddled in the corner of his small, single-room apartment. By day, Hughes and Richard Summers were filled with an abundance of free time. Time he could have used to build a second career or pick up a new skill, and had opted for the latter. How he was trembling despite the mild 65-degree temperature outside. Fear can do that to a person, he mused. He was sure he had secured every window, pulling the shades tightly closed to prevent even the faintest breeze from giving away what he dreaded might be lurking beyond the glass. Just slightly above him, position his right, was his work desk. A long-time enthusiast of the paranormal, Sean had spent much of leisure conducting into those investigations for people around the county. They were often desperate for answers, and he had no qualms about capitalizing on the fears. Though none of his investigations had ever yielded real evidence, he found enjoyment in the theatrics, especially when those theatrics put cash in his pocket. A well-timed gasp, a subtle jolt of surprise, and his clients were convinced. All it took was a few words of reassurance. Whatever they believed was haunting their home was no immediate threat. And of course, if they ever experienced anything unsettling in the future, they were welcome to call him again. He was, after all, quite the salesman. Spread out across his desk were Faust from Mary Jane's split, level house a few blocks away. She had contacted him after seeing an ad in the local newspaper. Paranormal investigation. Don't let you can't see control your life. As expected, the investigation had turned up nothing, though he couldn't deny that. Now and then, an unexplainable pang of unease would creep into his gut. Maybe that's just the price of bending the truth for a living, he thought. Moving with deliberate caution, and reached up to grip the edge of his desk. Slowly he rose to his feet, careful to distribute his weight evenly so as not to make a sound. The old wooden floor crumbled under the strain, causing him to freeze momentarily before carefully gliding toward the chair in front of his desk. Lowering himself into the seat, he straightened his posture and held himself still, attempting to merge into the chair's silhouette. If anyone, or anything, was peering in through the lightly shaded window, and would see nothing more than vague shadows, his hope was that by blending in, he would appear as nothing more than an indistinct shape against the backdrop. A moonlight was particularly bright that night, and as Sean sat motionless, he mentally cycled through every possible explanation for what he feared he had just witnessed. And wasn't the first time he'd found himself in this situation, and by now, he had learned how to manage his nerves. But no matter how familiar the feeling, the fear never faded. Pressing himself deeper into the chair, he attempted to press the involuntary tremors overtaking his body. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, he reassured himself. Hopefully, it's just paranoia. Though he was not a religious man, he found himself praying nonetheless, pleading with whatever force might be listening that this was all in his imagination, and was when he saw it. A shadow slid across the lower edge of his window. Just a tree, he told himself, though his stomach tightened at the sight. The moon is bright, the wind moves the branches, and the distorted chest plaques on my shades. It's nothing more than light in angles, like when people make shadow puppets with their hands. Yes, that had to be it. Then it happened again. This time he caught the movement more clearly, tilting his head ever so slightly, just enough to fully register what he was seeing. He observed the shadow glide steady across the lower right corner of the shade, drifting about a fourth of the way across before abruptly vanishing downward. A tree. Or at least that's what he hoped. It's just a tree, Shaw reassured himself, though a lingering doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. The moon remained bright, casting its glow against his makeshift projector, and once again the shadow reappeared. This time, however, it emerged on the opposite side. Mirroring its previous moving precision, he shivered. Maybe it's just a squirrel or a bird, he reasoned, and wouldn't be the first time one had smacked into his window. He still remembered the first time it happened. How the sudden, sickening thud had sent his heart racing, It had sounded like someone hurled a wet paper towel against the glass. The only evidence left behind had been a single black feather and a smeared, oily imprint, like the faint touch of a greasy finger. Not great for any aspiring criminals, he thought grimly. Then an idea sparked in his mind, and crawled to window and peeked from the left side, the sun side. The curtain pulls closed that way, so there's a slight gap I can use to get a look. If he stayed low, and was no background behind him. From the outside he'd be invisible, his body blending seamlessly with the shadows. Sean shivered again, this time from more than just fear. The most difficult part of his plan would be slipping out of the chair without making any obvious movements. Timing was crucial. But when? He had no way of knowing though, if anything at all. And I losing my mind. A cold shiver ran up his spine. Even if I can't afford to take any chances. He slid down in his tightly, his knees bending, his back curving uncomfortably. His hands gripped the chair's back legs, his fingers tight with tension. Moving his head ever so slightly, he turned to face the stark white shade covering the window. That was when he saw it. A shadow emerged, not abruptly, but gradually, as though something was approaching the window's slow, deliberate pace. It loomed in the center of the shade, its presence intensifying, growing darker and more defined by the second, like chinat shape, yet its frame was unnaturally thin, almost cartoonishly elongated. Sean's mind locked up in fear, and then his instincts cover, without thinking. He lunged sideways, toppling out of his chair with a dull thud, landing flat against the floor. He froze, repressing himself against the ground like a soldier navigating a field of barbed wire. His breath hitched. Did it see me? Slowly, he dared to lift his head. The shadow was still there. Panic clouded his mind from replaying his own movements. Had he been quiet enough? Had his fall gone unnoticed? His reaction, he realized, had been far from subtle. He may as well have been a blind dog summoned to open field. Still, the figure outside remained motionless. Too motionless. It was as if it were a statue, standing impossibly still, without so much as a flick of movement. The image sent an involuntary chill through his body, and for some reason, his mind flashed to old vampire films, where the creature stood eerily outside its victim's window, watching silently as they slept, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At the tension coiled tight inside Sean's chest, he was nearly at the window now. Just a few more careful, quiet movements, and he'd be close enough to see, close enough to know. And that thought terrified him. Sean stretched his arm, feeling for the wall. The corner of the room was steeped in darkness, while the rest was bathed in moonlight, making the shadows appear even deeper. Black hoved into his surroundings like portals to unknown destinations, beckoning him forward. The figure in the window remained still. Deep and low, he edged his body toward the wall. In that moment, he saw the shadow shift. His breath caught. Fear had heightened his senses, amplifying every flicker and every faint sound 100-fold. He realized then how hyper-aware the human body becomes in moments of terror. How even the most insignificant detail suddenly demands attention. Some say the greatest flaw of human existence is consciousness itself. The endless cycle of questioning, overanalyzing past issues, anticipating future dangers. One lemma always leads to another, creating an infinite loop of worry until anxiety takes hold. A gift, but also a curse. Sean fought to rationalize what he had seen. Of course it could have moved. In fact, it made more sense for something to shift than to remain perfectly still. Life is fluid, ever-changing, unmoving, like a brittle leaf detached from its branch. Clinging to his logic, he convinced himself that it had to be a tree branch, or maybe a raccoon, even large bird. He knew it was too big. The shadow had taken up nearly a fifth of his window shade. It had to be them. Suddenly, a new sensation overtook him, one that sent a sharp jolt through his nerves. A low vibration, faint but unmistakable, rippled through the floor. His desk trembled. His phone was ringing. Though he always kept it on silent, the buzz reverberated through the wooden desk, humming like an earthquake rolling through the room. repulsed in the flowballs his body, shaking his insides as like the bass at a crowded nightclub. Then, just as suddenly, the shadow dropped. It didn't retreat the way it had come. It simply vanished, plummeting downward like something had yanked the ground out from beneath it. Sean's pulse pounded. Keeping low, he lunged his phone, reaching above his desk his left hand and snatching it from the surface. He dropped onto his back, clutching the device tightly to his chest before fumbling to end the call. With one swift motion, he shoved it under his shirt, as if that could muffle its presence. Revolted, he glanced back at the window. Whatever had been there was gone. For now, he exhaled, barely realizing he'd been holding the air in his lungs. Slowly, he tugged at his collar with his right index finger, tilting the phone toward his face. Unknown caller. Perfect. Just what I need. His mind reeled, spiraling through the events of the night. His body ever betrayed him, his exhaustion finally overtaking his fear. Before he knew it, sleep pulled him under. His body sprawled out beneath the desk, lost in restless dreams. Then, light. Two bright beams cut across the window shade, scanning the room like searching eyes. Sean's eyelids foot open. He had no idea how long he'd been asleep. Groggy, he lifted the phone again. Only 15 minutes had passed. Still dazed, and momentarily forgot what had happened earlier, he stretched his arms, pushing himself up, first onto his knees, then onto his feet. Strangely, he felt rejuvenated, refreshed, despite the short nap, but the lights remained, shifting slowly from left to right. Now, only one remained, stationed at the far right side of the window. Then it hit him. The silhouette. Panic seized his chest as he threw himself back to the floor. Keeping his movements controlled, he crawled toward the left side of the window. Pressing himself against the wall, he reached Duff, gently hooking his right index finger around the edge of the shade. Slowly, carefully, he pulled it just enough to see outside, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A pickup truck sat outside, its high beams glaring ominously into his window. Sean inched forward, resting his chin on the ledge and necked the glass, where various framed family photos were lined up. His eyes flicked downward, briefly settling on an old picture and his brother. What's he doing right now? Probably fast asleep, oblivious to the creeping dread consuming Sean's mind. Then, a look back up, and his stomach dropped. The truck wasn't onto the street. It was on his lawn. It had veered nearly 20 feet from the road, leaving deep, muddy tracks in the soft ground, scars behind from the rainstorm earlier that day. The landlord's going to be pissed. But that was the least of his concerns. A driver was nowhere in sight, the cabin pitch black, a void against the blinding intensity of the headlights. The contrast unsettled him, reminding him of the darkened corners of his room, the places untouched by moonlight, the endless abyss he had feared only moments ago. Sean's gaze shifted toward the street, scanning his surroundings, the mostly silent, drenched in pale moonlight filtering through the trees. Everything seemed normal. Across the way, a few lights still glowed the apartments opposite his, likely from Sarah's place. She worked in customer relations for a major tech firm specializing in foreign markets, always up late dealing with time zone differences. His eyes drifted back to the truck, then beyond it, toward the forest on his left. That's when he saw them. Footprints. A distinct trail stretched from the woods, cutting across his neighbor's property. He traced their path with his eyes, following them step by step, from the tree line to the pavement, and across the grass stood his own building. The impressions deepened as they neared his home, each print more pronounced than the last. His breath hitched. The footprints were wrong. They had an uneven symmetry, each stride slightly longer than the average human step. But it wasn't the spacing that twisted his stomach to lape. It was their shape. Each print bore 4 appendages, the 2 outermost elongated, twice the lowest inner pair, which were close together, like someone pressing their middle and ring fingers side by side. The asylums splayed wider, while they tapered into sharp, unnatural points. He couldn't gauge their exact size from his window, but they seemed big. Too big. He glanced at the bushes lying his bud in for scale, and a realization crept into his mind. It stayed close to the wall. The tracks followed the side of his building with eerie precision, as though whatever made them had been deliberately blending in with the structure itself. Taking a page out of my own book, he thought grimly. Had it triggered any security lights along the driveways? Would anyone have seen it? Probably not. And was nearly 4 in the morning. Most of the world was asleep. His heart pounded harder as he followed the trail with his eyes. The prints grew larger in his vision as they approached his lair. He leaned forward, trying to see where they led, and then they were gone. A shiver crawled up his spine. He turned back to the treadling, its engine trembling slightly as it vibrated in place. But the footprints, where were they? His instinct screamed at him check the right side of his property to see where they continued. But there were no tracks leading away. His body turned to ice. It didn't leave. It didn't reverse here. Right now, a slowing realization settled over him like a thick fog. His mind pieced everything together as if solving a riddle. If Johnny has 6,000 apples and gives 1,000, and she returns 50, how many remain? A basic problem with an open-ended answer. The footprints had started in the woods. They had crossed the street. They had made a way to him, but they didn't continue forward. There were only 2 possibilities. Either had taken different or it was beneath him. His skin prickled with cold sweat. His hands trembled. A heavy wave of paranoia crashed over him. It was so simple. All he had to do was look down, beneath his window, to the ground below. His breathing turned shallow. His muscles tensed. But his eyes refused to move. Instead, he kept them locked straight-eyed on his neighbor's apartment. The woman who worked with foreign clients. She wasn't the one being hunted. He thought she was calm as a mund. Then, almost instinctively, he spun around. Nothing. Just the suffocating blackness pooling in the corners of his room. The abyss stretching out like a silent invitation. The void surrounded him, pressing in from all sides, a stark contrast to the moonlight spilling across the rest of his space. Slowly, he turned his gaze back to the truck. It was no longer vibrating. The engine was still running, the headlights glaring. But the subtle tremors were gone. Someone's in the car. Or was. The thought brought a fleeting moment of relief, until he realized how little comfort it actually gave him. His breath hitched as he finally turned his head downward, forcing his eyes to retrace their path. First, the apartment across the street. Then, the pavement. Then, his own lawn, patchy, speckled with untreated brown grass. Terror coiled in his gut. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to pull the shade down, to cover his eyes as girlfriend did during horror movies. But he didn't. He kept looking. His gaze reached the small garden bed directly beneath his window. Everything seemed normal, and then the truck horn blared. The sign ripped through the silence like a gunshot. Sean let out a strangled scream. Stumbling back was hard lodged into his throat. The truck was rocking violently, jerking forward and backward like someone was struggling inside. He squinted, desperate to see through the darkness of the cabin, but the lights only made it worse, blinding him, swallowing any detail in their overwhelming glare. The horn stopped. Then, suddenly honked agatic, scattered blasts, like a desperate message in Morse code. His mind barely registered it. His body had gone stiff, locked in place. Because without even thinking, without full understanding what he was doing, his eyes had drifted downward, and something was staring back. 2 massive, deep red eyes locked onto his freezing tear. He couldn't breathe. The thing beneath his window was pale, deathly white. Its skin looked as fragile as porcelain, stretched thin over its angular frame. Its mouth was skipping in a gross mockery of a smile, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. Long, sharp, and disorganized, as if they had been forced in a space too small for them to fit. Across its skull in thick buttons, ran along its skin, resembling the fragmented shell of a dinosaur egg. It raised its hands toward him. Slow, deliberate, revunk, like a preferring a blessing. Sean couldn't move. His muscles refused to obey, his mind refused to process, and then, Its head was bald and oval-shaped, eerily human yet mistakably wrong, when darkness, the truck's lights cut out, plunging the room into blackness. The creature vanished. A scream ripped from his throat as he lunged for the blinds, yanking them down with enough force to nearly tear them from the frame. He stumbled back, bolting toward his bed, nearly tripping over himself as he reached for the screen. His fingers fumbled at the screen. His breath was ragged, his heart hammering like a war drum. The screen illuminated his face, and a fresh way punished over him, vice and battery. His hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped the phone as he dialed. Ran truck's light, the freshen again off. On, off. Each time they illuminated the window, he saw it. The thing. It was clawing at the glass. The lights blinked again now. He shifted positions, its crude, gaunt frame twisting, contorting, moving with unnatural speed, as if caught in a nightmarish strobe light. On, off. Every time the light was closer, the phone stopped ringing. 911, what's your emergency? A woman's voice, steady, detached. Help, please. He screamed into voice cracking. His entire body trembled violently, his shirt clinging to his skin drenched in sweat. Sir, please state your emergency, the voice repeated, firmer this time. She could hear the hysteria in his voice. I need you to send someone, right please. The dispatcher's hand moved instinctively to her panel, pressing a button that sent a distress call to the nearest available units. She had been trained to stay calm in moments like this, but something about his voice made her uneasy. Help is on the way, Somi. Tell me what's going on. Sean's breath came in sharp gasps. He squeezed his eyes shut. The lights outside continued to flicker, and the thing and window was still there. Sean thought the dispatcher's words would bring him some relief, but they didn't. Not even a little. His fingers trembled as he switched the phone to speaker mode, keeping it close to his chest while forcing his gaze back to the window. No need to be subtle anymore. They already know I'm here, and Nim to know that they knew. One of them was still clawing at the glass. You're not making any sense right now, sir. Who thee? He hesitated, trying to force a coherent answer through the terror clogging his throat. His words tumbled out in a rush, erratic and breathless. He swallowed hard. A couple friends and I, we do ghost hunting as a hobby. Nothing serious, just for the thrill of it. We checked out a abandoned warehouse in the woods near my house. It was supposed to be empty. It always is. It's just something we do for fun. The warehouse took shape in his mind. The broken half-boarded windows. The other half gaped and open like the black void inside the truck's cabin. Like the bottomless eyes of the thing beneath his window. In the basement, we started getting strange readings on our EF detector, the trine that picks up electromagnetic fields. The signal kept getting stronger near the south wall. But the thing is, the wall was solid, stay calm. What happened next? The woman interjected. Sean barely registered her voice. His thoughts were already spilling forward. He went back the next day, rocked the wall down. A cold wave of nausea twisted in his stomach. We were right, there was another room. It was huge, almost as big as the entire foundation in the building. It had to continue underground, like some kind of cave, and the smell. His voice cut off. His breath hitched. His stomach clenched as the thing returned. It appeared at the right edge of the window now, smaller this time. Or maybe it was just an illusion. That's all, human vision is an illusion. But then he noticed something else. It was holding something. Someone. A limp figure, lifeless in its grasp. Dangling like a discarded doll, the shape was undeniably human. A cowboy hat sat atop its head, slightly tilted. The body beneath it was bulky, stocky, easily over 200 pounds. Sean guessed. Are you still there? Help is almost at your location. Are you okay? Sean's heart plummeted, because from the left side of the shade, another figure emerged. Identical, equally monstrous. Now were two of them. A horrible, child-like struggle unfolded before his eyes. The second creature lunged at the first, grabbing at the body like two kids bickering over a favorite toy. And then, the first one bit down. It clamped its jagged teeth into the limp man's left leg and yanked hard, a jerk in the body toward itself with a feral desperation. The second creature hissed. Then it too struck, lunging forward and sinking its teeth deep into the man's neck. A sickening spatter at the window. Sean couldn't see the details, but he knew what it was: blood. "Are you still there? I'm staying in the line until I get an answer." Woman's voice had changed. No longer detached, no longer robotic. Now, it was edged with urgency. "It's horrible," Sean managed to whisper, just enough to let her know he was still alive. Just barely. His vision blurred as the creatures ripped into the body, their long, spiny fingers tearing ray chunks of flesh, gnawing them like lions devouring a fresh kill. Then, abruptly, they stopped. Their heads turned, slow, deliberate, toward the window gym. Sean's entire body locked up. He was drenched in sweat, his shirt clinging to his skin, darkened with moisture. His limbs quivered violently, adrenaline surging through him like a current. His heart beat pounding so loudly that it felt like it was shaking his skull. The only thing separating him from the thing threatened a fragile pane of glass. He couldn't move, couldn't blink, could barely breathe. And they were still watching. Sean's heart putting so hard like it was trying to break free from his chest. Then, finally, he hearns. "Oh, thank God." "Stay with me, sir. It's not over until it's over. Are you still okay?" There was a lingering trace of worry in the dispatcher's voice. "Yes, I'm fine. But they're staring at me now. And no, I'm be back." He swallowed hard, forcing his breath to steady. "I'll finish the story to get down to the station." His voice had shifted, still shaken, but now tinged with relief. The nightmare was almost over. He could see the flashing light surging from the end of the street, growing larger as the police cars pulled up in front of his house. Then something terrifying happened. The moment the headlights fully illuminated the yard, the creatures turned. For the first time, Sean saw them in their entirety, unobscured by the window, the glass. The fucking shows, pale, unnaturally elongated. The sickly, naked body stretched in ways that made his stomach turn, and were even more horrifying through the veil of darkness. "Efrazi, don't move. We have you surrounded." The officer's amplified voice through the night, sharp as a crack of thunder. For a fleeting second, Sean was even more afraid. His grip tightened around his knees, bracing himself for what came next. And then, before the officer could finish his command, the creatures bolted. They lunged left, vanishing revostant. The searchlights followed, bouncing wildly as the officers scrambled to track them. Sean, almost fully relieved, staggered to the window and pulled the blinds open. The sky was red. Dawn was breaking. Red sky in the morning, sailor's warning. His voice barely carried in the stillness of the room. And then he saw the blood. His window pane was smeared with it, random streaks and splatters of deep crimson glistening in the early morning glow. He looked down. A mangled corpse lay in the garden below. After Vard, most likely the driver of the truck. The sight made his stomach lurch, but before he could even react, a sudden burst of light flooded his room. The police searchlight shone back onto his window, blinding him, forcing him to stumble backward like someone had just set off a flashbang in his face. "You're safe now, sir. You can come out. They're gone." Sean barely processed the words. "They're not gone." Not really. He knew it. The cops stand a chance of tracking them down. No one did. Except him. His legs felt unsteady as he made his way to the door, opening it slowly. He raised his right arm to shield his eyes from the lingering spotlights. As he stepped outside, the cold morning air hit him, sending a shiver down his spine. Then, he saw it. The truck driver's remains. His torso was ripped, his left arm lying a foot away from the head that was no longer attached. Beyond the mangled body, Sean could make out the footprints, the ones in the damp soil, the ones that stretched toward the woods. They veered left at one point, an escape route, but the prints didn't nerve him as much now, not after seeing their faces. their soulless eyes. "You are right, son." The voice made him turn. One of the officers was approaching, tall, thin man with a stern face and a thick mustache that shadowed his upper lip. Sean glanced at his name tag. Mike. When we got that call, we thought it was just a routine break. Officer Mike continued, his voice steady but his expression uneasy. "But what the hell were those things on your window?" Sean let out a shaky breath, his eyes dropping to the ground. He turned slightly, taking in his surroundings again. The truck, the red, tinted sky, the distant chirping of morning birds. He parted his lips, ready to answer, but then something caught his eye. A shadow. It was stretching from the rear taillight of one of the police cruisers. Officer Mike noticed the shift in Sean's expression and quickly turned his head. And that's when it happened. A pale, skeletal hand over the edge of the car, dragging long, thin fingers across the metal. The nails scraped against the surface with a slow, deliberate motion. Before either of them could react, before they could even scream, the creature leaped. It vaulted over the trunk, slamming into Officer Mike, tackling face first into the pavement with sickening force. Sean stumbled back, frozen in horror as the creature hovered over the unconscious officer. It was sniffing him. Then, its sunken withers locked onto Sean's, and then, it smiled. Not a grin, not a snarl, a wide, gaping, unnatural smile. And no, there was no glass to protect him.